I think it was the day before yesterday, or perhaps it was the day before that, that I posted a response to the Haitian refugees being shipped back. I use the word shipped because it's a forced displacement, isn't it? I mean, these are already multiply historically and continentally displaced individuals and seeking refuge in the United States, whose history of the colonial enslavement of human beings is part of the history of that enslavement. And I had done a piece on needing 3 Javits-sized armory spaces to present the documentation for this history as an artistic expression of a relationship to this particular history. And so today when I got up this morning and I was thinking, it's interesting, I don't need to make any art today. Didn't have anything in mind, and I like working, but sometimes a rest is feels good, you know, little time away from working. And so it was kind of a nice moment to have this feeling that I didn't need to make anything. And then I looked at NPR and I saw this image, and you know, I had implicitly recognized, you know, the image of the mounted enforcer of physical violence, and the relation of you know, the contemporary Border Patrol agent to the history of development of policing in the United States and its origins in disciplining and murdering and hunting African American slaves. And of course it's even more explicit in this image, in which the horse's reins are being used as a weapon and as being used as a whip. And you know, in the primaries here in California, Bernie Sanders won the Democratic ticket, and of course I voted for Sanders in the primary. And but when he lost the national primary, you know, I switched my support to Joe Biden, and I did so because Trump is a fascist, and Trump is a racist, and Trump is a misogynist, and Trump is lacks any ability to comprehend economy or history or or social responsibility, or evidence of the destruction that we're doing to the environment, and because he's fully invested in destroying the United States, because he profits from the destruction of the United States. He profits from malignancy and hatred and rage and producing a state of mental energy that that because it harnesses certain areas of the brain, make it difficult for individuals to process information rationally, and it creates a kind of haze of stupidity, in the mind of individuals and in the collective consciousness of America. And and whether you consider yourself conservative or liberal or radical or something else, it's difficult not to respond to the anger and hatred and malignancy that's spread. For example, like, I find it very difficult not to respond to this image with anger and malice directed at this bearded, white man on a horse holding his horse's reins as a whip. I mean, there's so much to be offended by. But that's, why I supported, Joe Biden. But I didn't have any illusions or delusions that, he was, anything other than what at one time, would have been called, a conservative. And it's only that our cultural values have shifted so much that we're willing to allow the Supreme Court to take away all of the rights of women, and we're willing to allow the Supreme Court and the very far right that dominates the Republican Party to basically eradicate, all of the accomplishments that were made in the civil rights movement, that were made in other, rights movements that were made by organizations like AIM and that have been advanced, through organizations like NOW and the radical work that individuals in the Black Panther Party accomplished in the 1960s, and individuals in the disability rights movement accomplished later, but within this same, zeitgeist of social challenge and change, and a vision of a kind of open and inclusive society in the most positive, sense. And so today when I read the reaction that Biden's entourage had of the images, not the events, but the images of this, I was thoroughly appalled. So rather than rethinking, what the administration is going to do in relationship to the Haitian refugees, instead, we're no longer going to have Border Patrol on horseback, because it looks bad that white folks are using horses' reins as weapons, it says. it says that these reins were mistaken for whips. Okay, mistaken for whips. So in what way is that not a whip? Because you didn't buy it in the whip store? Because he bought it in the horse's reins store? So when you whip your horse with the rein, it's still called whipping. It's not called reining unless you pull on the rein, right? So it's a whip, you know. Like, you don't have to be an Aristotelian ontologist to figure out that if it's performing the task of whipping, it's a whip. It's not mistaken for anything, right? So even the language in NPR, you know, that they're obviously like paraphrasing what was said, but it's appalling. You know, mistaken. It's not no mistake. I'm not. Am I seeing something that I'm missing? You know, my eye is missing that. That's not a whip. It's not a whip. It's a rein. It's being used as a whip, but don't mistake it for a whip, right? And don't mistake this image as an image of racial violence, because it's not. Except it totally is, right? And it always has been, and it's so obvious what it is. And this guy needs to go to my 3 Javits Centers filled with information about the history of this displacement. And then maybe he would understand. Because I'm sure if you asked him, you know, do you consider yourself a racist? He would say no. And besides that, you know, since he's in Texas, and critical race theory is probably illegal, he would probably walk away from the conversation, right? You know, and we don't need, you know, as Mitch McConnell says, right? We don't need this kind of knowledge of history. Americans don't need to understand their racism, right? What would that do? I mean, on the one hand, you know, it's so obvious how totally invested he is in the mythological past. He's got the white hat, brim comes down over his eyes. He's wearing all of the insignia of the marshal. Right, he's got his horse. His horse has even got like a little white patch on the white patch on the forehead, like the usual white patch on the forehead. And yet, you know, with all of that invested in this mythological identification with an imaginary historical past, still, you know, one is totally aware of the refusal to look at, you know, the facts of what this image entails, you know. So anyway, the decision was made because it looks bad. It's bad for our image. We feel those images are horrible. So this really interesting language, right? The images are horrible. The acts aren't horrible, but the images are horrible because they make it look like they're whips when they're just reins being used as whips. So we don't like that. We didn't like the images. We didn't like the spin. So their response to civil rights leaders and the outrage, right, that these images produced is that they're going to suspend the use of horse patrols along the Rio Grande or along the Del Rio, right? So, along in Del Rio. So the Homeland Security's response to the inquiries made, you know, about this violence and and this subjugation and this terrible oppression and this like refusal to recognize that the problem, it's much like 9/11 in a way, right? Okay, so the Taliban is the absolute result of American intervention in Afghanistan, and all of the outgrowths of splinter cells from from other imperialized and colonialized countries and communities in the Middle East, particularly Islamic communities, are outgrowths of violence and American colonialism, and some created, right, by the FBI, the CIA, and American military, right? So not the FBI, the CIA, but the CIA and the American military organizations, and then to forget and yeah, it's an outrage. 9/11 is an outrage, but the response, the nationalist response to it, and the flag raising, is a result of there not being 3 Javits-sized libraries filled with information detailing the history of why this happened and how it happened and how we created the situation. In the same way that we don't understand, that we created a situation of displacement, right, for, hundreds of thousands of refugees, not merely from Haiti, but from all over the world, and that the situations of displacement that we create are not only from other nations outside of the United States, but from within the United States as well. And so we're dealing with the United States' inhumane, counterproductive decision to deport thousands of Haitian refugees and illegal immigrants by changing the rules of how Border Patrol agents in Texas are going to police the imaginary border between Mexico and the United States along, the property that we stole from Mexico, right? Because that's also part of the history, right? So why? Because it looks bad. So we're going to continue to be doing bad things, but we're going to try to make it look less bad. And that's where the outrage for me is, that there's no self-examination. They didn't go to my library. Well, my library doesn't exist, but it could. It does exist in a certain sense. It's just that you have to do more work because the information isn't all gathered in one spot. But they have access to all of this information and history. The policies will remain the same, except we're doing stuff to try to mitigate how bad it looks. They might as well have said it that way. At least it would be more honest, right? So instead of saying, we feel those images are horrible and horrific, the statement could have said, we feel that those horrific and horrible images make us look bad, and so we're putting restrictions on the way that Texas Border Patrol agents will be able to police the border, so that the horror and violence that we are continuing to perform on Haitian refugees will be hidden from the media and the public. And that would have been an honest statement.